Hey everyone! Welcome back to Sleepless Historian. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where medicine was, shall we say, experimental. Where kings demanded heirs, queens faked morning sickness for politics, and alchemists swore they could tell if you were pregnant by, quote, how often you sneezed at dawn. So, dim your lights. Settle into your blankets. And let's float quietly into one of history's most bewildering obsessions, figuring out whether or not a royal womb had done its job. You see, in medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't a private matter. It was national business. A queen's belly was basically a political press conference. If a woman married a king, her main assignment was simple: produce a son, ideally several, in case the first few succumbed to the various medieval hobbies of dying early. And if she didn't conceive immediately, the whispers began. Monks, midwives, and men who thought bathing was witchcraft all gathered to decide the fate of an empire, based on whatever they thought pregnancy looked like that week. It was a time before ultrasounds, of course. Before pregnancy tests, before reliable calendars, and, unfortunately, before anyone really understood how bodies worked. Which didn't stop them from having very strong opinions about them. Let's start with one of my favorite bits of early medieval pseudoscience, the urine test. Now, the logic was almost scientific, almost. Doctors believed that pregnancy changed the vapors in a woman's body, which would, naturally, float down into her urine. So, they thought, if you wanted to know whether a woman was pregnant, you simply needed to analyze her pee. But not in a way we'd recognize. Oh no! The Salernitan method from the 12th century suggested that the urine of a pregnant woman should be the color of light gold, smell sweet as milk, and, here's the kicker, attract small insects. Yes. If flies landed on your urine, congratulations, you were expecting. If not, you were either barren or, tragically, just very clean. Naturally, this method produced mixed results. But it spread everywhere. Because, of course it did. Medieval Europe adored any theory that involved watching fluids change color. And soon, urine divination became an art. Professional water doctors, yes, that was their title, carried around glass vials and color charts, ready to diagnose your entire reproductive future from a sample. They called it uroscopy, which sounds fancy enough to be convincing. And to be fair, it was the closest thing to a medical test they had. Unfortunately, it was also completely useless. But that didn't stop royal courts from taking it very seriously. Let's drift over to the 14th century, the court of Joan of France, wife of King Louis XII. Joan was married off as a political pawn, as most royal women were, and almost immediately rumors began that she was infertile. Doctors were summoned to test her urine, her pulse, her complexion, even the way she laughed. One physician declared confidently that her womb was too cold. Another insisted it was too dry. A third recommended that she be lightly smoked beneath the garments with herbs of warming nature. Yes, you heard that right. They tried to fumigate her from below. Because if you can't make a queen pregnant, the next best thing is apparently turning her into an incense stick. But the creativity didn't stop there. For women who didn't trust the pianfly method, there were plenty of other, equally odd options. One popular medieval pregnancy test involved placing an onion or garlic clove inside the woman overnight, discreetly, of course. The next morning, if her breath smelled like garlic, she was not pregnant. If there was no odor, it meant her womb was sealed by new life. Let's just pause here and appreciate how horrifyingly intimate and bizarre this was. But, in their defense, it was based on a theory. They believed that if the womb was open, meaning not pregnant, air could pass freely to the mouth. If it was closed, the air, and the garlic fumes, couldn't escape. Science. It's also worth noting that this particular test came from ancient Egyptian papyri, centuries before. So, the medievals were not only making terrible medical decisions, they were doing so with a sense of tradition. And then there was the needle test, which feels like something out of a witch's toolkit. In this one, a small needle was dropped into a pot of urine. If the needle rusted quickly, it meant the woman wasn't pregnant. If it stayed clean, she was. Which sounds like a reasonable experiment until you remember that medieval metal quality and humidity made everything rust instantly anyway. In other words, by this standard, no one in medieval Europe was ever pregnant. Now, all this might sound silly, but the consequences were often deadly serious. A queen's fertility could make or break alliances. Entire wars were started because someone thought a royal womb wasn't doing its job properly. Take Henry VIII and his infamous lineup of wives. His desperate search for a male heir was basically a 16th century reality show, one filled with annulments, beheadings, and yes, plenty of medical experts poking around declaring who was fit to conceive. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce a surviving son, physicians blamed her melancholic humors. When Anne Boleyn miscarried, they said it was due to her excessive thoughtfulness. Because of course, emotional intelligence was a known medical hazard. By the time poor Anne of Cleves arrived, Henry decided she was so unattractive that it must have physically prevented conception. He actually complained that he couldn't bring himself to consummate the marriage because, quote, she smelled somewhat like a horse. Which, to be clear, was not supported by any medical documentation, just Henry's selective imagination. But in a world where men like him decided the fates of kingdoms, that was enough. Meanwhile, outside the palaces, midwives and herbalists had their own systems, often far more practical, though equally strange. Some recommended making a conception cake, which sounds festive until you realize it involved mixing wine, honey, and the woman's urine, then baking it and feeding it to a small animal. If the animal lived, congratulations. If not, well, maybe next month. Others used wine tests, mix a woman's urine with wine, wait a few hours, and if it curdles, she's pregnant. Apparently, urine chemistry was everyone's favorite laboratory medium. And yet, for all these creative attempts, most of the time the test was still just waiting 9 months to see what happened. Now, there's something oddly poetic about all this. Because behind the absurdity, the garlic, the fumigation, the pigeon-based timing charts, was a deep cultural anxiety. Royal women, especially, carried the unbearable weight of dynastic survival. A queen's worth could rise or fall on whether her body performed its political function. And since men controlled the diagnosis, failure was always her fault. A barren queen meant a cursed womb, a weak soul, or an angry god. A barren king, on the other hand, was simply unlucky. Convenient, isn't it? Let's float gently now to 15th century Spain, where Isabella of Castile, yes, the one who later financed Columbus's little ocean adventure, faced her own royal pressure. When she married Ferdinand of Aragon, their union was supposed to unify Spain. But early in the marriage, no pregnancy came. Court physicians tried everything from holy relics to herbal vapors. At one point, a priest advised that Isabella drink wine soaked with the ashes of a saint's bone fragment, to ignite the womb with divine warmth. It worked, apparently. Or perhaps time did. Because within a year, Isabella conceived. Historians disagree on whether the relic helped or whether it was, basic biology finally doing its thing. But she credited divine intervention. And the priests made sure everyone knew it, the power of faith, confirmed by a functioning uterus. Elsewhere, similar rituals emerged across Europe, a blend of religion and superstition, science and desperation. In France, some nobles consulted astrologers to determine fertility windows, because of course the stars knew your ovulation cycle. In Germany, women were told to urinate on barley and wheat seeds. If the seeds sprouted, she was pregnant. Believe it or not, this one sometimes worked, because certain hormonal changes in early pregnancy can slightly encourage seed growth. So, out of all the bizarre methods, this was the closest thing they had to a real test. And it was used, astonishingly, into the 18th century. Imagine that, royal physicians in powdered wigs, solemnly observing small pots of wheat, waiting for sprouts. Then there were the symptom lists. Medieval manuals described signs of pregnancy with great authority, most of which make absolutely no sense. According to one 13th century text, a woman who is with child shall yawn greatly, crave sour milk, and blush at the sight of roosters. Another added, her eyes shall glitter, her belly point like a cone, and her dreams be full of gardens. If only modern medicine were so poetic. Of course, many of these descriptions came from men who had likely never spoken to a pregnant woman in their lives. But they filled page after page with confidence, and Europe read them for centuries. All of this reveals something quietly tragic: the way women's bodies were interpreted, tested, and doubted by systems built entirely around male authority. A queen could be dissected by rumor. A common woman could be accused of witchcraft for the same symptoms that meant royalty elsewhere. Pregnancy was never just a condition. It was destiny. And behind the superstition and laughter, there's an echo of that same pressure: to prove, to perform, to survive. So tonight, as we drift back from those smoky royal chambers and candlelit bedchambers, let's leave the garlic and the urine jars behind. Let's remember that every strange ritual came from the same human impulse: curiosity, fear, and a longing for control in a world they didn't understand. And really, not much has changed. We've just traded garlic for Google. Soft music returns, slow harp tones. Let's drift now, gently, into our next tale. Because if medieval pregnancy tests were strange, the royal treatments that followed were something else entirely. So, where were we? Ah yes, hovering gently over a pewter bowl of questionable liquid. Because, in the medieval world, urine wasn't just a bodily byproduct. It was a diagnostic marvel. And, naturally, everyone was very confident about this. Doctors, or physicians, if you prefer the term that sounds slightly more qualified, believed that a person's urine revealed the secrets of their soul, their temperament, and possibly their lunch. They carried around little glass flasks called matuli, shaped rather poetically like tiny human bladders. Each morning, hopeful patients would hand over their sample. The physician would hold it up to the light, squinting thoughtfully, as though searching for spiritual enlightenment through a golden mist. And then, in the most serious tone imaginable, he would declare things like, "The patient is melancholic, because the hue is that of burnt honey." Or, "Ah yes, a fine cloud near the top, a sure sign of divine blessing," or worms. Because of course it was. Urine diagnosis was a full-blown art form, codified in medical charts that looked suspiciously like paint samples from a medieval Home Depot. There were names for each shade: pale straw, sunset gold, turbid amber. And, yes, blood-tinted despair. Now, you might be thinking, how does this relate to pregnancy tests? Well, in medieval logic, everything began with balance. Pregnancy was considered a disturbance in the harmony of the body's humors, the four essential fluids that, allegedly, ruled over all human behavior: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So, naturally, if a woman's humors were too harmonious, she was probably barren. If they were slightly chaotic, perhaps she was with child. And if she was vomiting every morning, well, that was either a blessing or witchcraft. Some of the earliest tests were beautifully vague. A woman suspected of pregnancy would have her urine poured over a pile of wheat or barley seeds. If the seeds sprouted, she was pregnant. If not, she wasn't. And if both seeds sprouted, well, congratulations, she was probably having twins. This method wasn't just folklore. It was actually recorded in ancient Egyptian papyri and later copied into medieval medical handbooks. And amusingly, when modern scientists tested it in the 1960s, they found it worked about 70% of the time. Which, frankly, is better than a lot of online medical advice today. Other tests were less charming. For instance, one popular method involved soaking a woman's urine-soaked cloth in wine. If she was pregnant, the belief went, the fumes wouldn't make her dizzy, because a pregnant body, being warm, supposedly absorbed alcohol differently. If she did get dizzy, it meant the wine had conquered her humors, and she was probably just bloated. Another test was to mix the urine with ashes, vinegar, or the milk of an unknown animal, preferably a goat, and then observe any unusual reactions. Now, what exactly qualified as unusual wasn't always defined. Bubbling, curdling, glowing faintly in the moonlight, all of these were considered reasonable indicators. In short, medieval doctors were not only performing chemistry experiments, they were also inventing performance art. But the true highlight, the one whispered about in quiet corridors of medieval abbeys, was the onion test. Yes, this is real. Here's how it went. A woman suspected of pregnancy would place an onion, or sometimes a garlic bulb, inside herself overnight. In the morning, the physician would perform the highly dignified task of checking whether her breath smelled of onion. If it did, she was not pregnant, because the scent had allegedly traveled through her body. If it didn't, the womb was sealed, therefore she must be expecting. It's unclear who invented this test, but one can only imagine the clinical trial process was lively. It was, however, one of the few pregnancy tests that actually made logical sense, at least by medieval standards. Because they believed the womb was a closed vessel once conception occurred, something like a divine lockbox. Of course, they also believed the uterus could wander around the body like a confused animal, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, medieval men, and we must admit, the medical field was mostly men, had many theories about pregnancy. And, predictably, most of them involved blaming women for doing something wrong. One 14th century text suggested that if a woman wasn't conceiving, she probably had a cold womb and needed to lie with her husband after warming herself near a fire. Another claimed that excessive reading could dry out the feminine essence, which is a very poetic way of saying stop learning and go make heirs. Even Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most brilliant minds of the 12th century, and a woman, couldn't fully escape the era's odd biology. She wrote that a woman's fertility depended on the divine balance between moonlight and breath. Though, to her credit, that's still far more elegant than most male physicians' theories involving garlic and goat milk. And then there were the superstition-based methods, the kind that make you wonder whether anyone actually wanted clear answers. For example, women were told to urinate on a metal plate. If the plate rusted overnight, congratulations, you were pregnant. If it didn't, perhaps the gods were still thinking it over. Others involved looking into mirrors after drinking specific herbs. If your reflection seemed altered, it was a sign that your humors were stirring toward motherhood. Or possibly, that you'd just ingested hallucinogenic herbs. Either way, progress. Let's drift, softly, to the courts of medieval Europe. Because while peasants were peeing on barley and onions, queens were undergoing their own high-stakes pregnancy tests, usually performed by court physicians whose entire careers depended on getting the answer right. A royal pregnancy wasn't just personal, it was political. It meant heirs, alliances, and the continuation of dynasties that were already, frankly, too interrelated for comfort. If a queen wasn't producing children, she wasn't just failing her husband, she was failing the state. So, royal physicians were under pressure to deliver hopeful news. They became masters of optimism. A queen could sneeze in the morning, and within the hour, rumors would spread through the palace that she was expecting. Take, for instance, Anne of Austria, wife of King Louis XIII of France. For 20 years, she suffered through miscarriages, false pregnancies, and the constant whisper that perhaps she was too pious for passion. Her court physicians were so desperate to give good news that they often declared her pregnant prematurely, once because she had a craving for fruit, which, admittedly, could describe roughly half the population at any given moment. When she finally did conceive the future Louis XIV, it was considered nothing short of divine intervention. Though one can imagine the royal doctors simply exhaling in sheer relief. The Tudors, of course, took it all to another level. Henry VIII's wives were basically living pregnancy tests in human form. Every flutter in the stomach, every fainting spell, was recorded, discussed, and sometimes celebrated with fireworks. Only for the entire court to awkwardly backpedal months later when the heir turned out to be indigestion. In 1534, one ambassador even wrote that Queen Anne Boleyn was most assuredly with child, based entirely on, and this is true, her slightly fuller cheeks. A bold diagnostic method, to be sure. And, naturally, Henry blamed the physicians when things didn't pan out. Though, considering his track record with wives, that was still a relatively mild reaction. You might think that with all these creative methods, someone would have stumbled upon a reliable test. But medieval Europe wasn't quite ready for hormones and chemistry. The concept of science was still deeply entangled with symbolism. Everything had to mean something mystical. A pregnant woman's glow wasn't due to estrogen, it was a reflection of divine favor. Her fatigue was the soul reshaping itself. And her cravings for salted fish were a sign of lunar imbalance. Because of course they were. By the late Middle Ages, however, things began to shift. Alchemy was giving way, slowly, stubbornly, to early forms of experimental medicine. The idea that you could test something and record a result was gaining ground. Physicians began keeping detailed notes, color charts, temperature readings, pulse rates. But still, the pregnancy test remained poetic. There was no laboratory, no litmus paper. Just intuition, urine, and hope. And perhaps, that's what makes this era so oddly comforting in retrospect. The methods were ridiculous, yes, but they were sincere. People genuinely wanted to understand life, even if their tools were onions and barley. And maybe that's a little bit endearing. After all, who among us hasn't looked for answers in strange places, a horoscope, a mirror, a late-night Google search, hoping to see a glimpse of certainty reflected back? The medievals just did it with slightly worse lighting and a lot more garlic. Let's drift softly forward now, to the next curious chapter in our sleepy little history, where the pursuit of truth and purity led to some of the strangest royal hygiene rituals ever recorded. Because if you thought pregnancy testing was strange, wait until you hear what kings were doing with leeches and rosewater. Hey everyone, still awake? Good. Though honestly, if you're already half asleep, that's exactly the right place to be for what comes next. Because tonight, we're drifting into one of history's most fragrant delusions, the medieval obsession with not bathing properly. You might imagine kings and queens as pristine figures gliding through marble halls in silk and perfume. But in reality, most of them smelled like a damp horse wrapped in lavender. Because bathing, the simple act of getting clean, was seen as suspicious. And not just mildly suspicious. Full-blown, you might open your pores and let in demons suspicious. Droplet the fear of water. The medieval world had a complicated relationship with water. They loved to look at it, listen to it, even build fountains shaped like lions spitting it. But touching it? That was another matter entirely. You see, the body was believed to have natural defenses, a kind of divine armor made of skin oils, good humors, and maybe prayer. Washing too much could weaken that armor, allowing illness to sneak in through the pores. So, people began to favor a more aromatic approach to hygiene. Instead of soap and water, they used powders, herbs, and perfume. Lots of perfume. Rosewater, ambergris, crushed violets, anything that could temporarily distract from the general odor of humanity. It wasn't uncommon for nobles to carry small bouquets called posies, just to sniff politely during banquets. The less polite reason? Because the people next to them absolutely reeked. Crown the bath that wasn't a bath. Now, that's not to say medieval people never bathed. They did, occasionally. But bathing was more like a ceremonial event than a hygiene routine. A royal bath required an entire team, servants to fetch water, others to heat it, others to sprinkle in herbs. Rose petals were mandatory. Sometimes, even cinnamon sticks floated on the surface, creating what was essentially a giant cup of monarch-flavored tea. The king or queen would soak for a few minutes, discuss matters of state, and then, critically, they would not wash with soap. They simply sat in the perfumed water until it was time to get out. So yes, it was less about cleanliness, and more about smelling faintly of damp roses while remaining technically filthy. The royal sweat problem. The 14th century French court was notorious for its perfume culture. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was said to bathe only twice a year, but she had servants constantly reapplying layers of floral oils and crushed amber on her skin. Her robes were lined with scented herbs to mask the royal musk. Louis XIV, the Sun King, took this to legendary extremes. He had a personal perfumer who followed him everywhere, because the Palace of Versailles was a biological hazard zone. Versailles had hundreds of courtiers, very few functioning bathrooms, and an alarming amount of velvet. There were entire rooms set aside simply to air out clothing. Louis himself was famously squeamish about bathing. He believed it caused fevers. So instead, he changed his shirt multiple times a day, sometimes up to 6 times, believing that linen had purifying properties. He also doused himself in so much perfume that courtiers were reportedly overcome when they entered the room. It was said that you could smell the king long before you could see him. Which, to be fair, is one way to announce yourself. Herb medieval mouthwash, don't try this at home. Oral hygiene wasn't much better. To freshen their breath, nobles chewed on cloves, fennel seeds, or occasionally little bits of silver foil. Some used wine mixed with vinegar as a kind of medieval mouthwash. Others gargled with honey and salt water, which sounds pleasant until you remember that dentistry was still, essentially, a hammer-based art. One 15th century text advised rubbing teeth with a burned hare's head mixed with honey. Because of course it did. Others swore by a paste made from crushed pearls and mint leaves, very glamorous, very pointless. Drop of blood, cleanliness, courtesy, and leeches. Meanwhile, physicians continued to confuse hygiene with medicine. If someone complained of fatigue or dizziness, they were rarely told to take a nap or drink water. Instead, they were recommended a refreshing round of bloodletting. The belief was that excess blood caused imbalance, a theme medieval medicine just couldn't let go of. So, leeches were applied liberally. Behind the ears, on the legs, near the temples, everywhere the humors might be hiding. A nobleman might begin his morning by losing a pint of blood for health. And if that didn't work, he could always try a laxative made from powdered coral. It's hard to say whether these treatments made anyone healthier, but they certainly made physicians very rich. Candle perfume is social armor. Perfume wasn't just for masking smells. It was status. It said, "I am so powerful, I can afford to smell like a garden instead of a goat." The wealthy imported oils from Venice and spices from the East, jasmine, musk, ambergris. Ambergris, incidentally, was a waxy substance that formed in the intestines of sperm whales. People wore it as perfume because it smelled earthy and divine. Which is one way to describe whale vomit, I suppose. Queen Elizabeth I was particularly fond of sweet perfumes. She even had her gloves scented with amber and roses, which courtiers imitated so enthusiastically that by the 1590s, the entire English court smelled like a perfumery on fire. Of course, she also kept her teeth blackened from too much sugar, a sign of wealth at the time, but no one dared mention that part. Skull dirt as divine protection. By the late Middle Ages, bathing had gained another, darker enemy, the church. Some clerics began to preach that bathing the naked body was immodest and morally suspect. Because if you were too concerned with your physical cleanliness, perhaps you were neglecting your spiritual one. Pilgrims and monks began to take pride in abstaining from washing altogether. Some saints were said to have gone decades without a proper bath, and were praised for it. They were untouched by vanity, though very much touched by everything else. One famous hermit claimed that his lice were pearls of holiness. And frankly, that's one of those historical quotes that's both horrifying and impressive. The royal obsession with looking clean. Still, even in their filth, nobles wanted to look immaculate. They powdered their faces with lead-based cosmetics to achieve a pure complexion, which slowly poisoned them, but it did create a nice, pale glow. Some even used crushed eggshells to smooth their skin. And yes, there were face masks made of bread soaked in milk. In portraits, everyone looks flawless and elegant. But behind the paint, most had acne, smallpox scars, and the faint aroma of something that had died weeks ago. There's an old saying that cleanliness is next to godliness. In medieval Europe, it was more like, cleanliness is next to witchcraft, so perhaps best avoided. Dove a soft reflection. And yet, despite all this fragrant chaos, there's something oddly human about it all. They were trying. They wanted to be clean, beautiful, and healthy. They just didn't have the faintest idea how. It's comforting, in a way. Because centuries later, we're still inventing rituals that make us feel healthier, whether it's detox teas or $200 face creams. The difference is mostly marketing. So the next time you step into a warm shower, maybe whisper a small thank you to the ghosts of medieval royalty. For walking so we could wash. Let's drift onward, softly, quietly, into the next story. Where royal self-care takes a strange and glittering turn. Because up next, we'll explore how European nobles tried to live forever and almost succeeded at dying beautifully. Hey everyone, still here? Good. Take a deep breath. Because tonight, we're floating softly through one of history's strangest fixations. The centuries-long obsession with not dying. You see, for all their power, wealth, and castles full of tapestry dust, the royals of medieval Europe had one great equalizer. They were still going to die, usually in uncomfortable and mildly embarrassing ways. And, naturally, they didn't like that idea one bit. So they began searching for ways to outwit death. not symbolically. Literally. Alembic alchemy, science's delusional older cousin. Our story begins, as so many do, in a smoky laboratory filled with jars, powders, and the faint smell of panic. The medieval alchemist was part scientist, part sorcerer, and part sleep-deprived hobbyist. They believed the universe ran on secret correspondences. That metals could mature like fruit. That lead could become gold if it felt emotionally supported. And that a clever enough person might just stumble upon the elixir of life. This was not a niche hobby. Kings funded these experiments. Popes encouraged them. Half the intellectual elite of Europe spent their evenings watching mercury bubble and whispering things like, "Yes, yes, it's definitely turning into something divine." It never did, of course. But optimism was half the job description. Test tube the Philosopher's Stone, now in royal packaging. The crown jewel of all this nonsense was the Philosopher's Stone, a mythical substance that could purify anything. Metal, the soul, or last night's questionable dinner. If you could create it, you could allegedly turn any metal into gold, heal all diseases, and live forever, ideally while looking like an ethereal candle flame. And so, royal courts were filled with self-proclaimed alchemists. They promised miracles, performed vague chemistry, and charged accordingly. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II practically built a small city for his collection of them. His court in Prague looked like a cross between a scientific institute and a haunted curiosity shop. Jars of bat wings, crystals, smoke, and occasionally human skulls, everything you'd expect in a wellness startup from 1590. Did it work? Of course not. But it felt important. And that, as with most expensive nonsense, was half the appeal. Crown the royals who drank themselves to death. Gracefully. The problem with searching for immortality is that you usually end up drinking something you really shouldn't. Take King Charles II of England, for example. A man who had everything, wigs, mistresses, and a chronic misunderstanding of chemistry. When he wasn't rebuilding London after the Great Fire, he was mixing up elixirs in his private lab. His favorite invention? The King's Drops, a solution of powdered human skull dissolved in alcohol. Yes, you heard that right. Charles thought that drinking liquefied bone might fortify the spirit. It did not. But it certainly fortified his reputation as a man deeply committed to bad ideas. And he wasn't alone. Many royals dabbled in what was called corpse medicine. It sounds worse than it is, which is impressive, because it's already quite bad. They believed that human remains contain vital essence. So doctors prescribed ground-up mummies, dried blood, or even a syrup made from crushed skull for ailments ranging from headaches to gout. Europe's elite were, in a very literal sense, consuming the past to prolong their futures. Skull mumia, the world's worst health supplement. The most famous form of this trend was mumia, a brown, resin-like powder supposedly made from Egyptian mummies. It was sold as a miracle cure, though in reality it was mostly bitumen, dust, and moral confusion. The real mummies of Egypt became so valuable that grave robbers and spice merchants joined forces to export them by the ton. When supplies ran low, some enterprising Europeans began making fake mummies by drying out freshly deceased criminals. And somehow, no one seemed bothered by this. In the 16th century, mumia was as popular as multivitamins are today. Doctors prescribed it for melancholy, nosebleeds, and death. You could buy it from any reputable apothecary, or less reputable ones, if you liked your corpses locally sourced. Droplet mercury, gold, and other terrible health ideas. But mumia wasn't enough for the ambitious immortalist. They wanted something divine, a metal, perhaps, infused with cosmic power. Enter mercury. It's shiny, it moves like magic, and it will absolutely kill you. Yet alchemists adored it. They mixed it into ointments, elixirs, and face creams. Even great physicians like Paracelsus experimented with it, reasoning that a little poison teaches the body strength. It did not. It mostly taught the body how to die slightly faster. In China, a few emperors also discovered the joys of mercury ingestion, often followed by their funerals. The idea traveled west, and soon European nobles were sipping various vital tonics that glowed faintly in the dark. Nothing says eternal youth quite like mild radioactive poisoning. Crescent moon beauty is a kind of immortality. Of course, if you couldn't live forever, you could at least look like you might. Royal beauty routines became their own form of spiritual warfare. Queen Elizabeth I covered her face with white lead and vinegar, a mixture so toxic it literally ate through her skin. But in portraits, she appeared ageless. Porcelain, divine, untouchable. Catherine de' Medici preferred arsenic powders, claiming they made her complexion clear as dawn. And in fairness, they did, for a few years. These women were the original influencers of mortality denial. They may have been slowly dissolving from the inside, but they did it gracefully, and under flattering candlelight. Scroll the alchemical dream of transformation. For all their absurdity, medieval alchemists weren't just mixing nonsense for fun. They were philosophers of change. To them, turning lead into gold wasn't just chemistry, it was a metaphor. They believed the human soul could also be refined, purified, and perfected. In a strange way, they were early psychologists, obsessed with the idea that suffering and decay were steps toward transcendence. Of course, they expressed this through recipes like: take the dung of a red rooster, mix with moonlight, and whisper 3 times. Not exactly clinical methodology. But the impulse behind it, the need to find meaning in impermanence, was profoundly human. Crystal ball royal death deniers. Even when royals finally faced death, they refused to do it humbly. Funerals became elaborate performances of immortality. Monarchs were embalmed, displayed in gilded rooms, surrounded by candles that never seemed to burn out. Their faces were painted with rouge so they appeared merely asleep, a little ironic, given the title of this channel. When Louis XIV died in 1715, his embalming took so long that the court nearly fainted from the smell. But when they finally unveiled him, he looked serene, glowing faintly beneath layers of perfume and denial. Death, for these people, was just another costume. Candle, and yet they were right, in a way. Here's the quiet, slightly comforting twist to all this. None of their methods worked, not the elixirs, not the mumia, not the mercury. But somehow, they did achieve immortality. Not in their bodies, but in their stories. We still whisper their names centuries later. We still picture them, powdered, perfumed, tragically beautiful, chasing eternity through candlelit halls. In trying to live forever, they accidentally became legends. And legends, as it turns out, never really die. So, maybe the alchemists were right after all. Maybe the soul can transform lead into gold. The heavy, ordinary life into something luminous and strange. And as you drift off tonight, remember that even kings and queens once feared the same thing you and I do. The dark unknown beyond the candlelight. But history, like sleep, has a way of reminding us that even endings are just another kind of transformation. Let's drift softly forward again. Next time, we'll wander into something even quieter. A tale of royal dreams, omens, and nightmares that changed empires. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're not, well, you're missing out on some of history's most unsettling bedtime stories. Tonight, we're drifting through a quieter kind of tragedy. The dreams of kings. Not their grand ambitions or imperial visions, but the literal dreams that came to them in the dark, whispering warnings they didn't want to hear. Because while medieval monarchs liked to think they ruled the world by daylight, night had other opinions. Crown when sleep was a spiritual affair. In medieval Europe, sleep wasn't private. It was cosmic. Every dream was a message. Every nightmare a telegram from heaven, or somewhere less polite. Monks and scholars kept dream manuals. Guides for decoding the nightly nonsense of the mind. Dreaming of water? That meant purification. Dreaming of fire? Passion, or hell, depending on your week. Dreaming of teeth falling out? Someone in your family was about to die. A fact that made dentists and priests equally nervous. And so, when a king had a dream, it wasn't just gossip. It was politics. Dreams could shift armies, rewrite wills, or cancel coronations. Crossed swords King Henry I and the bloody dream. Let's start with Henry I of England. A man who ruled efficiently, taxed mercilessly, and, apparently, dreamt prophetically. One night, Henry dreamed of his brother, William the Conqueror, standing at the edge of a dark river, calling to him. In the dream, William was pale, dripping with seawater, and silent. Henry awoke shaking, convinced it was a bad omen. The next morning, news arrived. His son and heir, William the Etheling, had drowned in the White Ship disaster. The entire next generation of the Norman dynasty washed away overnight. Henry never smiled again, according to chroniclers, which is impressive, considering medieval dentistry. Drop of blood, the nightmare of King Richard III. Then there's Richard III, a man history remembers mostly for scoliosis, murder allegations, and a questionable haircut. On the night before the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Richard reportedly dreamt he was wandering alone, surrounded by the ghosts of those he'd betrayed. They whispered his name, not affectionately. When he awoke, he told his attendants, "I shall die today." Which, to be fair, was the sort of thing you could say a lot as a medieval king and still be right eventually. But that day, it was accurate. Richard charged into battle, screaming, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" and was promptly unhorsed, killed, and buried under what is now a car park in Leicester. A rather poetic downgrade, really. The dream of Philip the Fair. Next, we drift to Philip IV of France. Nicknamed Philip the Fair, though not necessarily for his personality. Philip was the man who destroyed the Knights Templar, burned them at the stake, seized their gold, and congratulated himself on a job well done. But shortly after, he began dreaming, vividly, repeatedly, of the Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. In the dreams, de Molay appeared charred and solemn, muttering, "Before the year is out, we shall meet again." Philip, naturally, ignored this, because kings always do. He died within the year, and so did his sons, one by one, in quick succession. The dynasty itself collapsed, earning the family a new title, the Cursed Kings. It's almost as if burning monks isn't great karma. Kindle Emperor Constantine and the Flaming Cross. Of course, not all royal dreams were ominous. Some were marketing opportunities. Constantine the Great, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, claimed to have dreamed of a blazing cross in the sky, and heard the words, "In this sign, you shall conquer." He painted the symbol on his soldiers' shields, won the battle, and converted the Roman Empire to Christianity. So yes, history's single biggest religious shift was technically based on a dream. You can almost picture the medieval sleep therapists nodding smugly. Catherine de' Medici in the glass coffin. Jump forward a bit to Catherine de' Medici, the French queen who practically defined political paranoia. Catherine surrounded herself with astrologers, dream interpreters, and anyone who could promise advance notice of doom. According to her diaries, she once dreamt she was lying in a glass coffin, watching her own funeral. When she awoke, she had her servants redesign her bedroom. More windows, fewer mirrors. She claimed it was for air, but everyone knew it was about the coffin. Years later, when she died, her body was placed in a glass-topped sarcophagus, exactly as in her dream. Coincidence? Or just history's favorite hobby, irony? Skull Ivan the Terrible and the Falling Bell. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Ivan the Terrible had his own problems. Mostly himself. He was prone to visions, migraines, and something resembling moral confusion. One night, he dreamed of a great bell falling from a tower, shattering on the ground. He told his advisors the dream was meaningless. They agreed enthusiastically. Weeks later, his eldest son died suddenly, struck, allegedly, by Ivan's own hand in a fit of rage. Ivan fell apart. He spent his final years pacing the Kremlin, terrified of sleep. ringing church bells to drown out the silence. You can't really blame him. His dreams had terrible follow-through. Waxing crescent moon, the last dream of Marie Antoinette. Our final dreamer tonight was neither medieval nor lucky. Marie Antoinette had been imprisoned after the French Revolution. In her final days, she told her guards she kept dreaming of open fields, of running barefoot through grass, hearing laughter somewhere she couldn't reach. She said, "It feels like freedom." 2 days later, she was taken to the guillotine. She stepped onto the scaffold calm, almost serene, as if she'd already rehearsed it somewhere quieter. For once, her dream had told the truth. She was going to be free, just not in any earthly sense. Candle the nightly kingdom. Dreams were, for these people, more than imagination. They were diplomacy with the divine. And sometimes, they were the only place a king could be powerless. In their sleep, they met the same truth that peasants did. That control is an illusion. That death is patient. And that no amount of gold, prophecy, or candlelight can delay what's already written. It's oddly comforting, really. For all their crowns and thrones, they were still just humans, closing their eyes at night and seeing things they couldn't understand. So if your mind ever wanders before sleep, if you dream of something strange or sad or oddly peaceful, you're in good company. You're drifting through the same mist that once visited kings. And that's where we'll rest tonight. Between sleep and memory. Between candlelight and silence. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're wandering through the royal sick rooms of Europe, where medicine met leeches, and sanity was more of a rumor. It's easy to forget that power doesn't come with a warranty. For every glittering crown, there was usually a trembling hand beneath it. And in an age when healthcare involved sawing things open and hoping for divine intervention, mental illness was less a diagnosis and more a scandal. Let's drift through a few of those stories, softly, slowly. The ones that smell faintly of lavender, candle wax, and absolute despair. Crown King Charles VI of France, the well-beloved. Our first royal patient was Charles VI of France, who began his reign young, handsome, and full of good intentions. They called him Charles the Well-Beloved, which, in historical terms, usually means give it a few years. At first, Charles was popular. He lowered taxes. He smiled at peasants. He seemed like the kind of king you could invite to dinner without regretting it. Then, he began to unravel. During a 1392 military expedition, Charles suddenly drew his sword and began attacking his own knights. When the dust settled, several were dead. And the king was shaking, wild-eyed, whispering that enemies surrounded him. From then on, reality came and went like the tide. He sometimes forgot his own name. He claimed he was made of glass, so fragile that he refused to move unless padded with cushions. Servants had to sew metal rods into his clothing to keep him upright. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. He thought they'd shatter him. And yet, even at his worst, the court kept up appearances. They'd dress him in gold, seat him on his throne, and hope no one noticed that the King of France was quietly convinced he was a vase. The treatments, leeches, lavender, and lunacy. You might wonder, how did medieval doctors treat a delusional monarch? Badly. Their options were, roughly, bleeding, burning herbs, or making the patient drink something that probably shouldn't be drunk. Physicians believed madness was caused by an imbalance of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So they tried to rebalance the mind by draining it. That meant leeches on the temples, cupping scars along the spine, and enemas flavored with rosemary for that royal touch. Sometimes, they'd prescribe music, gentle lute melodies, because the vibrations might resettle the thoughts. It's possible they were just trying to calm themselves down. When none of it worked, they'd simply pray. Which, in fairness, was the only treatment that didn't make things worse. Crown Joanna of Castile, La Loca. Next, we drift south, to Spain, where Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, was born into one of history's most aggressively political families. She was clever, educated, and beautiful. But in royal circles, those traits often came with a diagnosis. Joanna fell deeply in love with her husband, Philip the Handsome. A man whose name was, let's say, accurate in the least useful ways. Philip flirted constantly, cheated openly, and seemed bewildered by Joanna's emotional responses to that. When he died suddenly in 1506, possibly poisoned, Joanna's grief became obsession. She refused to bury him. She ordered his coffin opened repeatedly, to make sure he was still there, and still beautiful. Chroniclers, being medieval men, immediately labeled her mad. They locked her away for the next 46 years. Modern historians suspect severe depression and trauma. But in her time, that was simply female hysteria. Her son, Charles V, eventually inherited her crown. He visited once in decades. When asked how his mother was, he said, "Still loves my father too much," which is one of history's colder diagnoses. Syringe, the medicine cabinet of the damned. Let's pause for a moment and admire the medieval royal medicine chest. Inside, you'd find powdered pearls, for calm; gold leaf, for the spirit; crushed emerald, for melancholy vapors; and, of course, copious mercury, for making sure none of the above worked. Mental health remedies were usually indistinguishable from mild poisoning. One 15th century physician recommended drinking the blood of a freshly killed animal, preferably warm, for vitality. Another advised rubbing pigeon droppings on the forehead. Because, as always, science marches on. If the patient improved, it was credited to divine grace. If they worsened, the devil was involved. No middle ground, just miracles and demons. Candle King George III, the Mad King. Now we drift forward to the 18th century, where enlightenment had arrived. But medicine hadn't. King George III of Britain, poor man, was not so much mad as catastrophically misdiagnosed. He suffered from what we now know as porphyria, a genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. But at the time, no one knew what porphyria was. They just knew the king was suddenly babbling for hours, talking to trees, and writing 50-page letters to no one. During his worst episodes, his urine reportedly turned deep blue, which his doctors took as a good sign, because blue is the royal color. They treated him by bleeding him daily, forcing him into ice baths, and strapping him into a restraining chair for his safety. He'd scream, pray, apologize, sing hymns, and fall silent for days. The courtiers whispered that the king had lost his mind. His son began quietly preparing to rule. Yet George recovered, at least for a while. He went on to reign for decades longer, outliving most of the doctors who had tried to fix him. There's a certain poetic justice in that. Alembic the mad doctors. The people treating these monarchs weren't cruel, just profoundly wrong. They truly believed the body and soul could be tuned like an instrument. A little bleeding here, a little prayer there. Surely, harmony would return. Some even experimented with music, scents, or color therapy. One physician believed madness could be soothed by blue glass windows. Another by forcing patients to smell oranges at sunrise. You can almost imagine a medieval hospital ward. Rows of nervous nobles, breathing citrus and humming Gregorian chants, while a monk with poor hygiene recites Aristotle. It's absurd and a little heartbreaking. Stethoscope when sanity was a privilege. For royals, madness wasn't just an illness. It was a crisis of image. A mad king threatened the stability of the entire realm. So courts lied. They covered up symptoms, fabricated recovery proclamations, and let regents quietly rule behind closed doors. The crown had to appear unbroken, even if the head beneath it was cracking. Sometimes, these patients became symbols of divine mystery, as if God himself was testing them. Other times, they were simply hidden, a human problem politely placed out of sight. That tension, between spectacle and secrecy, defined royal illness for centuries. Candle madness, in the end, was just another crown. When you think about it, these stories all rhyme. Charles the Glass King, Joanna the Mourning Queen, George the Babbling Monarch. Each of them powerful, each of them alone, and each of them trapped in a time that saw sickness not as suffering, but as weakness to be disciplined out of existence. They were treated, punished, and prayed over, but rarely understood. It's strange comfort, maybe, that their pain now feels familiar. That in their chaos, we glimpse our own fragility. Only theirs was embroidered in gold thread. So tonight, as you drift off, remember the kings and queens who whispered nonsense to the stars, and the doctors who answered with equal nonsense. They were trying, in their way, to fix what couldn't be fixed, to bring peace to minds that ruled worlds, and yet couldn't find rest in themselves. The world moved on. The science changed. But the human ache beneath it, that remains. Let's leave them in their candlelit chambers for now. Next time, we'll drift towards something gentler. A story of royal childhoods, and the strange, sheltered little worlds where princes and princesses learn to fear daylight. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on the childhoods of Europe's most privileged prisoners. The royal children. They were born into palaces and gilded cradles, yes, but also into duty, surveillance, and a kind of emotional frost that no fire ever really melted. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to be a child destined for the throne, well, imagine being a porcelain doll that everyone loves and no one touches. Castle the Royal Nursery, a gilded cage. Let's start in the 13th and 14th centuries. The age of castles, crests, and chronic coughs. Royal nurseries were not cozy places. They were ceremonial institutions. A prince or princess was separated from their mother almost immediately after birth, handed to a team of wet nurses, attendants, and physicians, who debated the temperature of their milk with the seriousness of a state council. Love was considered dangerous. It softened children, made them sentimental, which, to the medieval mind, meant weak. So affection was rationed. Hugs were rare. Smiles were recorded in chronicles as if they were political events. Baby Henry VI, born into a burden. Take Henry VI of England. He was born in 1421, the only son of King Henry V, the man who'd conquered half of France and inspired centuries of patriotic theater. The baby was crowned King of England at 8 months old. His father had died of dysentery, his mother was sidelined, and the court decided that this tiny creature now represented divine order on earth. Imagine being raised not as a child, but as a prophecy. By the time Henry was 6, he was signing royal decrees he couldn't read. At 10, he was told he was also the King of France. At 12, he was sitting on 2 thrones he didn't want. He grew up soft-spoken, bookish, and devout. A gentle soul in a violent century. Naturally, it ended badly. He became a pacifist in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, which is sort of like bringing a prayer book to a sword fight. Historians now believe he suffered from severe depression and mental breakdowns, but his contemporaries just called him unfit to rule. He spent years in prison, a boy king turned ghost, haunting his own crown. Drop of blood, the children of the Tower. Few royal childhoods ended as abruptly as those of the princes in the Tower. Edward V of England and his younger brother, Richard. When their father, Edward IV, died in 1483, the boys were brought to the Tower of London for their safety. It was a comforting lie. They were never seen again. Most believe their uncle, Richard III, had them quietly killed to secure his throne. Though, as always in history, there's just enough doubt to keep people arguing forever. The tragedy is that, by all accounts, the boys were lively, kind, and had no understanding of the deadly game they'd been born into. They weren't heirs. They were hostages of blood. And even now, the Tower feels heavier for it. A place where bedtime stories curdle into ghosts. Crown Louis XIII, the boy who learned to flinch. Over in France, Louis XIII, father of the Sun King, wasn't murdered, but might have preferred it. His father, Henry IV, was assassinated when Louis was 8. His mother, Marie de Medici, ruled as regent, and treated him with the same warmth one might reserve for a tax ledger. When he misbehaved, she locked him in dark rooms. When he cried, she told him his father's ghost was watching. Louis developed a nervous tic, anxiety, and a lifelong distrust of intimacy. At 14, he was forced to marry Anne of Austria, a political alliance between two countries that barely tolerated each other. The wedding night was awkward, formal, and largely symbolic. For the next 20 years, the couple barely spoke. And yet, through the lonely quiet of his childhood, Louis became rigidly dutiful. The perfect Catholic king, shaped not by love, but by fear of disappointing everyone. Handled the sad education of Princess Elizabeth. Now, across the channel, Princess Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I of England. You might picture her as the confident virgin queen of legend, but her childhood was more like a Gothic cautionary tale. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was 2. Her father, Henry VIII, alternated between ignoring her and occasionally declaring her illegitimate. She was shuffled between households, watched constantly, and taught that her survival depended on silence. As a teenager, she was nearly destroyed by scandal. Flirted with by her guardian, the ambitious Thomas Seymour. The incident haunted her for life. By adulthood, she trusted no one, slept poorly, and ruled with the kind of calculated solitude that only the lonely can perfect. When courtiers asked why she never married, she replied, "I will have one mistress here, and no master." That wasn't pride. It was self-defense. Wineglass the royal playpen. It's worth remembering, royal children didn't play the way other children did. Toys were rare. Games were moral lessons. And every move they made was supervised by someone taking notes. If a prince laughed too loudly, the tutor might write, "Displays common temperament." If he wept, excess of the mother's influence. By 6, most royal children were trained in ceremony. How to walk slowly. How to bow at precise angles. How to speak as if every sentence were a decree. Even their bedtime prayers were rehearsed for witnesses. Sleep was a performance. Stethoscope illness and innocence. Many royal children never lived long enough to grow up at all. Child mortality didn't care about crowns. Smallpox, measles, and fevers swept through nurseries like whispers of fate. Doctors prescribed crushed rubies, holy relics, and occasionally pigeon broth. The infants of Europe's greatest dynasties died quietly in silk sheets. Their names remembered only because someone wrote them on a genealogical chart. But for the few who survived, survival itself became a burden. Every cough was a matter of state. Every fever, a national crisis. It's hard to imagine a childhood less free than that. Broken heart, the inheritance of loneliness. The strangest thing about all this is how cyclical it became. Lonely children grew into distant parents. Distant parents raised lonely heirs. And the dynasty continued, each generation repeating the same gentle cruelties, under the guise of royal duty. Even the great Louis XIV, the Sun King, kept his own son at arm's length, terrified that affection might weaken him. The boy grew up morose and resentful, and died before his father, having never really lived as anything more than a shadow. History remembers the kings and queens, but not the soft-spoken children who became them. The ones who learned to sleep with their hands folded, and their hearts locked behind etiquette. Crescent Moon, a soft ending. So, as you drift off tonight, think of those little heirs in their quiet rooms. The silk curtains drawn, the candles burning low, and the sound of footsteps echoing down marble corridors. They were surrounded by everything, and comforted by nothing. Their cradles were carved from gold, but they rocked in solitude. Their lullabies were sung by strangers, and their dreams belonged to politics. If there's a lesson in that, it's perhaps this: privilege doesn't cancel loneliness. It just gives it better furniture. When you wake, you'll remember the castles, the Tudors, the fragile crowns. But for now, let them rest. Let the little kings and queens sleep in peace. Something they were rarely allowed to do in life. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've ever walked through an old palace and felt a shiver that wasn't the draft, you might have brushed against what history left behind. Because monarchs, it seems, are terrible at letting go. They couldn't stop ruling when alive. And, apparently, not even death could convince them otherwise. Tonight we're visiting their afterlives. Those dim corridors where kings and queens linger, haunting the places they once commanded. Still fussing about etiquette and eternity. No jump scares, no screaming portraits. Just quiet, elegant hauntings. The kind that sight through keyholes and settle into tapestries. Crown Henry VIII, still pacing the hall. Let's begin, inevitably, with Henry VIII. The man who divorced, beheaded, and bankrupted his way into infamy. The legend goes that Henry's ghost still roams Hampton Court Palace, where he once dined, danced, and plotted new marital disasters. Visitors and night guards report the same thing. A heavy, uneven tread echoing down the long gallery, followed by the faint scent of gunpowder and wine. They say he moves slowly, dragging one leg. A reminder of the festering ulcer that made his final years unbearable. Occasionally, a deep sigh fills the air. As if even in death, he's tired of his own appetites. And perhaps he is. After all, Henry spent his life trying to control everything. His wives, his faith, his waistline. And in the end, he controlled nothing. So maybe he walks those halls not out of malice, but out of habit. A king still looking for a door he never found. Ghost and Boleyn, the headless queen. Naturally, we can't mention Henry without the ghost of Anne Boleyn, who, depending on the storyteller, manages to haunt every Tudor residence at once. Her most famous appearance is at the Tower of London, where she was executed in 1536. Witnesses over the centuries describe her gliding silently, dressed in gray or white, carrying her severed head in her hands like a tragic accessory. Others insist she simply kneels in prayer, her form flickering like candlelight. A woman still waiting for forgiveness she never received. At Hever Castle, her childhood home, the haunting is gentler. She's seen walking through the garden near the yew trees, her expression calm, as though she finally found a moment of peace that eluded her in life. If she does haunt Henry at Hampton Court, and some say she does, it's not to terrify him. It's to remind him that she still exists, when all his power turned to dust. Candle Mary, Queen of Scots, the restless guest. Across the border, Mary, Queen of Scots, is arguably Britain's busiest ghost. Beheaded in 1587 after a lifetime of drama, she's been sighted everywhere from Holyrood Palace to Fotheringhay Castle. Her spirit, they say, glides through long corridors, her face half in shadow, her presence both regal and weary. Even in death, Mary couldn't stay still. Her body was moved repeatedly, first buried without ceremony, then reinterred by her son, James VI, in Westminster Abbey, just a few steps from Elizabeth I, the cousin who signed her death warrant. It's easy to imagine why she lingers. A life of confinement, a death by execution, and an afterlife spent sharing a tomb complex with the woman who destroyed her. Some fates are simply too ironic to rest. Mantelpiece clock, the Grey Lady of Glamis. Now let's drift north to Glamis Castle in Scotland, a place so steeped in superstition that even Shakespeare couldn't resist it. It's said to be haunted by Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, a 16th century noblewoman burned at the stake for witchcraft, which, in translation, usually meant annoyed a king. Her ghost appears as a pale figure, sometimes with hands clasped in prayer, sometimes weeping quietly near the chapel. The staff call her the Grey Lady. She doesn't threaten, she mourns. And that seems to be the common theme with these royal hauntings. They're not about vengeance. They're about unfinished loneliness. When you spend your life being watched, judged, and used, You don't always notice when you die. Skull Charles I, the gentleman ghost. Charles I, the only English king ever to be executed by his own people, is said to haunt Windsor Castle. Witnesses describe a faint scent of tobacco and a quiet, dignified voice reciting prayers in the garter room. It makes sense. Charles was nothing if not formal. A man who refused to remove his dignity even at the scaffold. When he was beheaded in 1649, the executioner held up his head and cried, "This is the head of a traitor." Charles's lips, according to witnesses, still moved for several seconds. Some claimed he was praying. Others said he was forgiving. Either way, that's quite an ending to linger on. So perhaps it's no wonder he returned to the one place where he'd once been treated as sacred. A ghost, yes, but still insisting on good posture. Of the tragic children of Versailles. Over in France, the ghosts are quieter still. At Versailles, tourists often report the laughter of unseen children near the Queen's apartments. The locals whisper that they're the spirits of Marie Antoinette's children, especially little Louis Charles, the boy who died alone in a prison cell after the Revolution. He was only 10. And though the monarchy fell, people say his soft footsteps still echo through the marble halls at dusk, as if he's looking for a mother who never came back. Sometimes, the Queen herself appears, a pale figure in a white gown, walking through the gardens she once loved. Not the doomed queen of the guillotine, but a tired mother, searching for her son. There's a strange tenderness to that image, isn't there? Haunting not out of vengeance, but out of love that refused to vanish. Candle the philosophy of royal ghosts. It's tempting to laugh off royal hauntings, a mix of folklore and too much candlelight. But they do reveal something true. These were people trapped in roles too big for their hearts. And in a way, that never ends. A farmer dies and is forgotten. A monarch dies and becomes legend. Their mistakes replayed, their names whispered by strangers for centuries. If you were that ghost, would you really leave? Maybe not. Maybe you'd linger a little, just to make sure they still remembered your side of the story. The mirrors still remember. In old castles, mirrors were often covered after someone died. Not for superstition, but courtesy. They believed the soul might get confused and linger in the reflection. At Hampton Court, they say one mirror still fogs on its own, as if someone is breathing on the glass from the other side. At Versailles, another shows faint impressions of faces, not visible to the eye, but caught on photographs. Of course, that could all be coincidence. Or maybe, just maybe, the mirrors have good memories. Candle a sleepy farewell. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, think of the ghosts we've met. The king still pacing. The queen still waiting. The children still playing in marble corridors. They don't want to scare you. They just don't know how to leave. They had everything except peace. And now they have eternity to look for it. So if you ever find yourself walking through a palace at dusk, and the air feels just a little heavier, don't be afraid. Just whisper, "You can rest now." Because maybe, after all these centuries, that's all they're waiting to hear. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're heading back to the royal bedchambers. But not for romance. For treatments. The kind that made you wish for a quick death instead of a cure. Because in the medieval and early modern world, royal doctors were the most confident and least informed people alive. They worked with 4 bodily fluids, a few herbs, and a prayer. And yet somehow, they always sounded so sure. Let's drift through the age of holy poultices, blessed leeches, and medical decisions that, in hindsight, explain a lot about history. Crown the royal theory of fluids. First, we need to understand the basics. The theory of humors. According to medieval physicians, every person contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health meant balance. Too much of one, and you were doomed. Feeling sad? Too much black bile. Feeling angry? Too much yellow. Feeling tired? probably demons. And if you happened to be royal, well, your bile was more important than everyone else's. Court physicians made entire careers out of balancing their monarch's insides. They prescribed diets, purges, and treatments involving things that should never go near a human body. Which brings us, gently, to the golden age of leeches. Bug the leech whisperers. Leeches were fashionable. Not just for peasants, but for princes. They were said to purify the blood. As if the problem with medieval royalty was that they weren't bleeding enough already. King Charles II of England, for instance, was so overtreated with leeches that courtiers began referring to him as his bleeding majesty. When he fell ill in 1685, his doctors applied over 700 medical interventions in 1 week, including 18 bleedings, purges with mercury, and a live pigeon strapped to his head. He died, of course. Peacefully, if you can call internal mercury combustion peaceful. But to be fair, they meant well. Scold the royal urine inspectors. Before modern medicine, a king's health was measured not by his pulse, but by his pee. Doctors would collect it in glass flasks, hold it up to the light, and hum thoughtfully, as if performing alchemy. The color, smell, and vibe of the urine told them everything they needed to know. Cloudy yellow with floating threads meant liver imbalance. Deep red with bubbles meant love sickness. And faintly glowing blue probably meant the royal kitchen had been experimenting again. Queen Elizabeth I once scolded a court physician for announcing her humoral imbalance to the entire Privy Council. She told him, "My urine, sir, is not for public debate. A fair boundary, really. Candle holy remedies and blessed bandages. Because monarchs ruled by divine right. Their illnesses were thought to have divine causes, which meant cures often involved saints, relics, and, for the especially dramatic, pieces of the true cross. Louis IX of France, for example, traveled everywhere with a relic of Christ's crown of thorns. When he felt ill, he pressed it against his forehead. King Edward the Confessor had a similar routine. He touched sick subjects to heal them. A ritual called the royal touch. It was said to cure scrofula, a tubercular swelling of the lymph nodes. Thousands lined up to be touched by the king's hand. And sometimes, they actually got better, which was either divine grace or a particularly convincing placebo. Alembic the poison paranoia. Royalty also had a chronic condition known as paranoia. They feared poison more than anything, often for good reason. So their physicians became part doctor, part food taster. Cups were tested with unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks. And meals were sprinkled with powdered pearls for protection. Pope Clement VII, in the 16th century, had a team of monks pray over every loaf of bread before he ate it. He still died of poisoning, likely from his own medicine, a mercury-based cure for stomach pain. History, it seems, has a sense of humor. Snake Cleopatra's Pharmacy. If we drift slightly east, we find Cleopatra, who may not have been medieval, but absolutely would have loved medieval medicine. She kept a private collection of poisons and antidotes, testing them on prisoners to advance science. One of her favorite treatments was bathing in fermented donkey milk, which allegedly preserved youth. According to Roman gossip, it mostly preserved the smell. Still, when she finally chose her own death, she went with something natural, elegant, and deadly. The bite of an ASP. Poetic. And possibly less painful than a Tudor enema. Droplet the medicinal oddities of the Tudors. Speaking of the Tudors, their approach to health was equal parts medical and medieval art project. Henry VIII, for instance, was treated for his ulcerated leg with a paste made of honey, ground pearls, and pigeon droppings. His daughter Elizabeth I swore by a tonic of vinegar and powdered coral to preserve the complexion of chastity. And Edward VI, the frail boy king, was once prescribed ground emeralds for youthful vapors. It didn't help, but at least his insides sparkled. Cough in the bleeding of Louis XIV. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had more doctors than friends. They bled him for fevers, for dizziness, for dreams that displeased him. At one point, he was losing so much blood that courtiers reported he looked like candle wax under a veil. Still, he insisted on daily purges, claiming it kept him in harmony with the cosmos. In the end, he outlived all but one of his children. Perhaps sheer arrogance can be therapeutic. Herb Catherine de' Medici's perfumed potions. We can't forget Catherine de' Medici, who turned medicine into performance art. Her apothecaries created hundreds of restorative scents, perfumed tonics meant to calm the nerves or heighten the senses. She was especially fond of burning orange peel and sulfur, which, according to her court, soothed the womb. It also probably asphyxiated half the chamber. Still, in her mind, she was breathing in holiness. And in an age before penicillin, belief was the strongest medicine available. Thought balloon a quiet reflection. It's strange to think that these people, with all their crowns and marble corridors, were so fragile inside. Their bodies were as breakable as anyone's. And the people meant to heal them often did more harm than time itself. But maybe that's the most human thing about them. They suffered, they hoped, and they trusted someone with gentle hands and terrible science. Because in the end, whether you're a king or a pauper, you just want to feel better. And you'll believe almost anything, if it's whispered softly enough. So as you close your eyes tonight, think of those candlelit chambers, the scent of herbs and beeswax, and a physician in a velvet cap murmuring Latin over a bowl of leeches. Sleep, like medicine, doesn't always work immediately, but it always finds you eventually. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're settling into a quieter kind of story. The strange, sad, and occasionally ridiculous ways that monarchs prepare for death. Royalty, after all, spent their lives pretending to be immortal. And when death approached, they didn't go quietly. They bargained, they staged, and they filled their last days with rituals meant to outweed eternity. It never worked, of course, but it did make for some spectacular final acts. Crown the death rooms. In medieval and early modern courts, a royal death wasn't private. It was theater. When a monarch began to fade, their chambers transformed into sacred space. Tapestries were drawn shut, candles lit in odd numbers, and relics of saints were arranged at the bedside, like divine insurance policies. Even the air was managed, filled with incense and rose water, so no one could smell what was really happening. Attendants whispered constantly, praying, crying, or pretending not to notice the dying person listening to them. The monarch would be surrounded by clergy, doctors, and ambitious relatives, none of whom agreed on what was best. It's no wonder so many kings died exhausted. Candle the good death. To die well was an art form. A proper monarch was expected to remain calm, composed, and pious. To forgive enemies, thank God, and ideally look photogenic while doing it. They called this a good death. Failing to die gracefully was considered almost shameful, like sneezing at your own funeral. So even when the pain was unbearable, monarchs forced themselves to smile, muttering rehearsed last words for the benefit of the chroniclers. Louis XIV, for example, spent 4 days dying in public, giving moral advice to everyone who entered the room. At one point, he told his attendants, "Why do you weep? Did you think I was immortal?" Which is either Stoic wisdom, or a very French way of saying, please stop crying, you're ruining the mood. The mirror superstitions. Mirrors, as we touched on before, were feared at deathbeds. It was said that if a dying person's reflection remained visible, their soul might be trapped inside. So, attendants covered mirrors with black cloth and turned portraits to face the wall. Even the windows were shrouded, so the departing spirit wouldn't escape too soon or too late. Everything, in other words, was managed. Even the way someone left the room forever. Skull the curse of Charles IX. One monarch who didn't go quietly was Charles IX of France, the unfortunate young king behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. By his mid-20s, he was coughing blood, and convinced he was cursed. He begged priests to exorcise his rooms, slept with relics under his pillow, and refused to be alone, because he swore he could hear the screams of the murdered. When he finally died in 1574, his body bled spontaneously from every pore. Doctors called it a sweat of death. Chroniclers called it divine justice. Even now, people say his ghost still sighs in the Louvre, not haunting others, just replaying his own guilt. Dove Mary Tudor in The Scent of Roses. Mary I of England, known to history as Bloody Mary, had a softer superstition. In her final illness, she surrounded herself with white candles and rose petals. She told her attendants that the scent would guide the angels. When she died, witnesses claimed the room filled with a sudden fragrance of flowers, so strong it lingered for hours. Her half-sister Elizabeth later joked that Mary had left perfume, if not peace, which might be the most Tudor epitaph imaginable. Candle the Emperor's Clock. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, retired to a monastery in Spain after ruling most of Europe. He brought with him a single clock, the same one that had hung in his throne room. As he grew older, he noticed the clock's rhythm slowing down, almost as if it were keeping pace with his heart. When it stopped one morning, Charles smiled faintly and said, "It is time." He died that afternoon. His attendants swore the clock began ticking again that night, steady as before. It's a nice story. And maybe, in some small way, it's true. Coffin the dead should stay still. After death, things only got stranger. Royal bodies were too valuable to decompose normally, so they were embalmed, perfumed, sealed, and displayed, sometimes for weeks. Louis XVIII's corpse, for instance, was so thoroughly stuffed with preservatives that his attendants claimed he looked healthier dead than alive. Others didn't fare as well. Henry VIII's coffin famously exploded due to internal gases leaking onto the church floor. Witnesses claimed a stray dog licked the spilled remains. Clergy later called it a sign from heaven, which seems generous. Drop of blood, the royal heart tradition. Some monarchs didn't want to stay in one place at all. It became fashionable to separate the heart from the body, a kind of medieval organ donation to the divine. Richard I, the Lionheart, was buried in 3 different locations: his heart in Rouen, his entrails in Calais, and his body in Fontevraud Abbey. The idea was spiritual multitasking. If you were buried in multiple holy sites, you could hedge your bets in the afterlife. Modern historians call it pious fragmentation. The rest of us might call it unsettling. Crystal ball, the last omens. Of course, every royal death had omens. A falling candle, a black bird, a portrait cracking down the middle. Queen Victoria, shortly before her death, insisted she saw her late husband Prince Albert standing by the fire. She smiled and said, "You've come to fetch me." And she was gone within hours. King George V, meanwhile, was reported to have looked at his doctor and muttered, "God damn you," which, to be fair, might have been justified. The doctor later admitted he gave the king a fatal injection to end things more quickly. It seems even royal exits were stage-managed. Candle rest at last. There's something oddly comforting about all of this, isn't there? That even the most powerful people in the world were terrified of the same quiet ending as the rest of us. They surrounded themselves with relics, prayers, perfumes, anything to make the moment softer. And when it came, it was usually just a breath, a flicker of a candle, and silence. Because for all their crowns and ceremony, death never needed permission to enter. It simply bowed and waited. So tonight, as you drift toward your own small sleep, that harmless imitation of dying, remember the kings who tried to bribe fate, the queens who prayed to stall the dawn, and all the golden rooms that ended in whispers. Close your eyes. The world will keep turning without you for a little while. And that's all right. Sleep well, traveler. You've made it to the quiet part of history.